What's up, guys? My name is Fari, and I build systems that remove bottlenecks within businesses. And I've been documenting my builds for 100 plus days on my way to 365 days of building each and every single day. So, in today's video, I'm going to be going through how I'm building my engine without becoming a jack of all trades. Basically, the question that I ask myself and how I'm thinking of it in terms of one engine pulling multiple gears, and also how it works well together, and as well as the main lesson through this build. So if we jump straight first into the question that I asked myself, which is, am I doing too much? And I think this is one of the questions that are so important in terms of asking, hey, am I doing too much? Am I becoming a jack of all trades and a master of none? Which is one of the main things that I wanted to shy away from, because I just want to be the person that is ultimately focusing on one thing and building one thing only and scaling that one thing. And the way that I thought about this is simply asking the question of, what do people see? And by asking this question and also just getting feedback from different people that I've spoken to, and also just gathering, data points, I've ultimately understood that people see one of these three things. They see daily videos, they see newsletters, they see guests, and they see client builds. So basically getting a taste of all these four key components that ultimately people see on the outside. Basically, from what they see, they ultimately see someone that does, hey, I do daily videos, or I do a newsletter, which I recently just rolled out now, or I just have guests on that I speak, but what is the point of all of this? Or if they see the other aspect of it, which is basically the client builds. So from the outside, it looks scattered all over the place, basically the saying, a jack of all trades but a master of none. But the problem that I've ultimately gathered from all of this is a lack of clarity on what I really do. And I want to be able to solve this specific question so that it's more easily digestible. So if I walk up to someone, they instantly know what it is that I'm doing. So fun fact, back in the day, I used to be known as the guy that was the tech guy that always did Apple reviews and Apple product videos. And through that ultimately gave me an insight in terms of how I want to basically be able to solve this specific problem, which is conveying what it is that I'm actively doing on a day to day, and basically focusing on, having a higher degree of clarity around what it is that I do, which is ultimately building back-end systems that ultimately, remove bottlenecks and also power business growth. So now the question becomes, how can I pull this with one engine through different gears? And the question that I ultimately need to, solve or basically answer is understanding it in different layers. Basically, everything revolves around this one thing, which is ultimately the business, which is the ops systems and client build, where we're basically just building, the back-end systems and also the ops dashboards that we're ultimately building. And that ultimately encompasses everything that I do. So it's more so looking at it that this is the foundation that ultimately everything revolves around, and what are the other key components that I'm building around this, so that it's somewhat of an ecosystem that I can ultimately just stack on top of, rather than getting shiny object syndrome. So saying I'm focusing on 20 different things, but every single thing that I'm focusing on, or the three lever points, are ultimately pointing back directly at the ops systems and client builds. So that is basically what I'm optimizing for. And the next question might also be, so what are these three different levers that I'm ultimately pulling? Well, this is ultimately the daily videos, and these daily videos basically act as the logbook, so real-time documentation in terms of my OS, my operating system, that governs how I'm thinking through solutions and also the decisions that I'm making, so that I'm tracking it in real time in terms of how I'm thinking about things, if I'm failing at something, and also if something is working, that we're ultimately able to use this as a logbook or a digital logbook that we can ultimately use as a source of truth to understand that, hey, in this specific moment in time, we thought, we were supposed to be building in this manner, but through time, we've realized that the approach that we've had is all wrong. And how are we then going to be able to understand that? Through these daily videos, which act as the logbook, which ultimately points back specifically to the business, because everything needs to be centered around what it is that I'm actively doing. I think shiny object syndrome comes when you're focusing on things that don't ultimately point back on what it is that you're doing at its core, and that is ultimately something that I want to avoid, but I want to also be able to stack, different things that I'm doing in a manner that ultimately points back to the main focus, which is ultimately the ops systems and the client builds, because that is the number one thing that ultimately everything needs to point back to. So then we take a look at the newsletter, which is ultimately the library, which ultimately acts as my framework and written breakdowns on. So this is basically the layer where I'm ultimately documenting my builds in written format, so not necessarily in the same format in terms of how I'm recording these videos, but at a much deeper level, and also pulling different levers in terms of what I'm sharing on there is not going to be the same as what I'm sharing on this, because it's going to be more structured and more super dialed in terms of the exact mechanisms and things that I'm actively thinking at a far deeper level than these videos. And that ultimately acts as another layer in terms of pointing back to the specific builds that we have, because they ultimately act as the frameworks and written breakdown in terms of projects that we've done and the way that I'm thinking through certain solutions. And ultimately having these point to the business is the way that I like to look at things, and the way that I want to also avoid shiny object syndrome is saying, hey, let's dilute my specific time by stacking so many things, but through these different things they ultimately don't serve a purpose. So if you want to see this ultimately acts as a logbook, the daily videos, and then we have the library layer that ultimately acts as a framework and written breakdowns layer, which ultimately also means that we have another one, which are the guests, basically the people that are ultimately coming on and I'm chatting to, which is also super fun. But also we need to also think about this in terms of the layer and how it ultimately contributes to the business, which ultimately means that this acts as an amplifier layer and expands signal and perspective. I think one of the most important things, in as much as I'm building on a day-to-day basis, it's also understanding from different industries and connecting with cool people doing cool things as well, because you never know the nuggets that you're ultimately able to get through one conversation, and also through those conversations also sharing value for other people that are watching. I think that is ultimately the most important function as well, in as much as I can focus on the business layer and focusing on this ultimately pointing back to the ops systems and the client builds that we're building as well. But I think one of the most superficial or abstract layers of this, of specifically for the guest amplifier layer, is ultimately being able to bring a different perspective for me as well, in understanding different things from different people in different industries, because you just simply never know the nuggets that come out of it. And I'm super bullish on that, in terms of being a lifelong learner and learning different things from different industries, because you just never know what is applicable in their industry may also become applicable in your industry if you're just able to steal like an artist, quote unquote, and ultimately come up with new ideas. Because in as much as we can focus on the daily videos, we can focus on the newsletters, by pulling these two layers alone we won't be able to reach a new perspective, basically gathering new perspective and new ideas from different people, and also being able to document that as well, but also being able to network with cool people doing cool things at the same time. So, in a nutshell, this ultimately means that these three levers are ultimately pointing back to the specific business. So they act as lever points or gears in this example that ultimately point back specifically to the ops systems that we're building, and as well as the client builds, so that we're also making sure that what we're doing is ultimately structured, even though on the outside it may look like we're pulling different levers, but on the back end we're ultimately focusing on dialing this in and making sure that we're able to then make sure that this works together. And through that means the biz drives content. So basically the real builds equals case studies, so making sure that the builds that we're making and also creating also act as a case study in itself, and also understanding that the content aspect of it drives reach, in the sense that the videos slash newsletters attract operators and founders, basically the people that are operating at a much higher level, that ultimately amplifies the reach that we ultimately have towards them than what we would have had if we're not doing it. And I think this is one of the most important things to understand, that we're focusing on so many different thinking through so many different lever points that we want to make sure that it's super structured, and that we're not just scattered all over the place, but we're layering strategically. And through this layering strategically, we're then able to understand, the roadmap for what it is that we're building into the future, and understanding that the guests drive amplification, so borrowed networks and compounding ideas that ultimately fuel back into what it is that we're building, which is, the ops systems and the client builds, making sure that all of them essentially orbit around the business. If they don't orbit around the business, which is the center point or the foundation, then ultimately that means we're wasting motion. And that is the way that I'm actively thinking about, making sure that we're combating, being a jack of all trades, but we're structuring it in a way that ultimately points back to the business. And just pulling these different lever points, I know that into the future, we're then ultimately going to get these compounding ideas that are going to unlock nuggets for us, that are ultimately going to scale what it is that we're doing. And I know by, pulling these different gears or lever points, we're ultimately going to be able to strike, what works, and also understand, hey, is this specific roadmap working or is it not? And how do we constantly just re-dial in what it is that we're doing? And I know that, from the outside, it looks like, we're just focusing so much on so many things, but ultimately the number one thing is that every single thing needs to make sure that it's acting as a key multiplier in its own right. And through this means that we're actively learning how and what we need to integrate and what we also need to get rid of. So that leads us to the lesson, the overarching lesson for this, which is ultimately not focusing on doing everything, because it's not me just focusing on doing every single thing. It's building one system with multiple lanes, basically one system, one engine and multiple gears, that ultimately acts as a compounding layer for clarity and leverage over time, basically creating as much leverage as we possibly can in different facets, and also understanding, the data as well, because I think one of the most important things is diving super deep in terms of the data, and understanding what is working and what is not working into the future is ultimately going to allow us to really dial this in and fully understand that, hey, this is what's ultimately working into future, and this is ultimately what's not. So for example, if we're layering, the daily videos, which now, we don't get so many views on them, then we understand that, hey, this is a logbook, it's going to take time, but we're ultimately going to post each and every single day, because this acts as a compounding mode. Or we take a look at the newsletter and say, hey, the newsletter is not popping up as much as it should we still keep this layer in or not? But ultimately also understanding that I'm dialing this in and saying, hey, this needs to be a once a week, so that we are also able to just keep up with the volume and not do too much all at the same time. But then we're ultimately focusing back on the systems and the client builds that we're all actively building. And I think all through these things that we're actively thinking about and layering on top of each other, I know that we're ultimately going to reach the level of clarity that ultimately scales our impact as well, and also gets us to the grand vision where we're ultimately, inspiring millions of people, reshaping industries, and having, scalable impact. And I know that we're going to get there. It's going to take a lot of trial and error, and we're just going to keep on going and never giving up. But this is how we're actively just focusing in on building that level of clarity in terms of what it is that I do and what it is that we do on a day to day, so that it's easily digestible, and also people understand what it is that we're doing, so that if they want to collaborate and we can help them, with their specific challenges, then we're able to do that, and we're able to then scale the level of impact that we also have. So that also makes me super excited to think about this in terms of layers, how we're basically pointing every single thing back in terms of, the business as well, and how this also just acts as a compounding mode in terms of level of clarity for thinking in terms of our builds. Like I always said in the beginning, in the first 100-day videos, that ultimately this acts as a layer that ultimately compounds our knowledge through time, and also scales our level of impact. So I'm super excited Gonna be diving deep as always into this, gonna be refining, rejigging, and I'll probably make a part 2 once we get a lot more deep and technical in this. I just want to make sure that we're super dialed in terms of the structure and how we're thinking about things. Then we're ultimately gonna take it up a notch. I think small steps, testing for free, quote unquote, before you pile every single thing in, is ultimately the approach that I like to always take. So yeah, if you guys enjoy this video, make sure to check out the newsletter. It's the first link in the description. Also, links for my socials are also in the description. So X, LinkedIn, Instagram. And yeah, if you guys want to connect with me, like I said, just follow or check out, my socials, or even just check out the newsletter. It would mean a lot. So yeah, if you guys enjoy this video, make sure to connect with me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram, and I will see you guys in the next video.